Okay, let's get into the meat of this episode. I thought it was fabulous. I really, really liked it. Like I said in my intro video, I'm really excited to see Rick back on the screen. And I would love to say that this is going to be a short video, but I don't know if it will be. I haven't talked about The Walking Dead for a long time now, for 2 months, and I got a lot to say. So let me start by saying we don't see any really obvious hints of Beth in this episode. It is very much about Rick, as it should be. But we are seeing a lot of callbacks to Grady. And as we get into things, I'll talk about how I'm seeing ties between this and Rick's last episode, which was 9:05, and Michonne's last episode, which was 10:13 in the flagship show. And maybe most importantly to TD, I'm seeing a lot of ties to 5:12, which was them, which was where the music box woke up. So it's super exciting, and I just feel like things are really, really coming together in the way that we have said for a long time that they will, and that's always super exciting. All right, so we start with seeing that Rick tries to kill himself at one point. Obviously, we're going to tie that back to Beth, all right? But most importantly, he doesn't actually make the attempt. But there is the I tried theme, which we've seen a lot in TWD. We can't link that exclusively to Beth, but I know that we saw it a lot around her, especially in Consumed. Daryl and Carol said it a lot in Consumed, which was when they were searching for Beth. So it's something that I always tie back to her, even though that's not by far the only time we've seen it. It is kind of a show-wide theme. I really want to do kind of a special interpretation, I guess, of the opening credits. And I'm not going to do that right now because I really need to get Galadriel Jones's input on it. They have maps and locations are her specialty, the geography of everything. But we do see Portland and Omaha, and then something up in it's not super specific, but like in the New York / Pennsylvania area. So right up there. And yeah, those are places we've talked about for a long time with the CRM. And so it's important that they're actually showing them to us now. So it's like everything that we've seen hints of before and that we've only seen in the background is now front and center here. And that's really, really nice to see. Okay, so we definitely get a lot of clarity here on the CRM and what's going on. We learn that people who are brought in are put into the consignment program, and they have to stay there for 6 years before they can become citizens. And so Rick has been there, and obviously he's tried to escape many times. We also saw Silas in that program in The World Beyond. So it's something we've seen before, but we just got a lot more details on it here. I'll get into in a minute how they explain the A and the B. But first, let's talk about Rick cutting off his hand. Obviously, wow. For those who don't know, he actually did lose his hand in the comics, but much, much earlier. And here's the first tie to 512. I've actually wondered for a long, long time whether they were going to do this or not, but I was 50-50 on it. So in this scene, in 512, we see a walker almost bite him on the arm, and Daryl gets there in time, and, Rick's fine. He doesn't get bitten and everything. But I wondered if that was a foreshadow that eventually he would lose his arm. And the reason that I was unsure whether it was an actual foreshadow for the show or not is because they do that in the comics, and it's just at a different time. And sometimes The Walking Dead does do nods to things that are in the comics that are not actually going to happen. So a really good example of that was in season, I want to say it was 11. No, it must have been 10 because it was before Michonne left, when Michonne and Ezekiel kiss. And remember, it was really random and everyone freaked out about it. And then they just kind of said that they were both missing their significant others, and it was just something that happened, but they remained friends and it didn't have to be weird. And, clearly they're not actually going to have a romantic relationship. But that was very much a nod to the comics, because in the comics, it's Michonne and Ezekiel and Rick and Andrea, and they've just kind of changed up the romantic partners for the show. So I didn't know if this thing about Rick's arm was just a nod to the comics or if they were actually going to do that. Well, clearly they were actually going to do that. And this is why it's super important and why it makes me really, really excited, because as I said, I'm seeing, and I did say this a while ago, but it's been a long time, that after we started to learn some of the stuff about the CRM, we didn't know anything about the CRM back in season 5 when Coda happened, and then when the music box woke up, we didn't know anything about the CRM at that point. But in recent years, especially the last 3 or 4 years, as we've learned more, I've gone back to that speech of Rick's about, his famous "We Are the Walking Dead" speech that he gives in the barn. He talks about war. He talks about his grandfather who said, "Forget yourself and go to work," basically. And, you have to survive now. You can live later. And I started to realize that that was probably a foreshadow of the CRM and the war that's coming that is way far beyond where we were at this point in season 5. And especially with this episode, I'm seeing the fulfillment of that. I mean, think about what they showed in this episode. I did not give a spoiler alert at the beginning of the episode, so just so you know, if you haven't watched, I'm going to be talking all kinds of spoilers. Sorry, I should have put that at the beginning. But that's basically what happens with Rick in this episode. He has to accept what he has for right now and not die, not kill himself, just go out there. And in a lot of ways, he is. So in the speech he gives, in the story that his grandfather told, he says, get up every day and act as though you're dead, or act as though you're going to die so that you can be tough enough to live or to survive. And then you get to live later. Right. And that's pretty much what Rick does. I mean, he tries to escape several times. He gets hurt. He cuts off his hand, but then he accepts it. And he even burns the letters that he wrote to Michonne and the phones that he had scratched her image into. And in a way, that was like a death for him. Like he was letting go of her emotionally. And that was so he could survive. And only after he did that did he actually run into her. So that's really, really important symbolically. But my point is that in 512, 510. I'm saying 512 and I mean 510. 510 them, we had that speech, right? We had, which I believe was a foreshadow of the CRM. We had him almost lose his arm. He didn't, but it was a foreshadow of his losing his arm eventually in the CRM, which we saw in this episode. And in that same episode, the music box woke up. And I think that's really, really significant. Now, again, I'm not really, really holding my breath on seeing a lot of Beth in this series, but it would make sense to me because of that music box. If maybe, in the very last episode or something, they gave us a really obvious hint that she's alive or she's out there, even if we don't actually see her. Or maybe we see a flash of her once, but she's not really a part of the story. I could totally see something like that. But it's just really significant to me that in that same episode, the music box woke up. So yeah, Rick lost his arm. That's obviously important, and poor Rick, but at the same time, I was kind of excited to see it. And not in a way for Rick, like it really sucks to be Rick right now, but just from a symbolism standpoint, because I've kind of been waiting for that for a long time. All right, so he loses his arm, he cauterizes it. He has these really great dreams about Michonne, which I thought were really, really sweet. And they're really, really interesting, too. In the first one, she's wearing purple. We're not entirely sure why that is. We don't see purple on Michonne that often. But purple is the color of royalty, and these two are definitely being set up as the king and queen of the apocalypse, right? He does ask about cartography, which made me smile because, again, the maps are important. And Galadriel Jones especially is an expert at the maps, and I always get her input on that because she's way better at it than I am. And so she's going to have all kinds of fun dissecting this for us, I'm sure. He talks about waking up in a military hospital. That's very much like Beth. I mean, with hers, it wasn't a military hospital, but she did wake up in a hospital. There was a lot of talk about being trapped and not being able to get away. And so what I came to realize by the end of the episode was that here, at various times, Rick is paralleled with Beth at Grady, but he's also paralleled a little bit with Noah. So we kind of see both sides of it, because obviously he's trying to get away and Beth tried to get away. But then he kind of starts to accept it and say, I tried, but I couldn't do it. I've become trapped. And in the dream, when he sees Michonne says, you're not trapped. And that's what Beth says to Noah. So it's a very, very similar theme, if not the exact same theme that we saw around Beth at Grady, in the sense that she's trying to escape, she's trying to get away, but she can't. Or at least she doesn't, that we see in season 5. So I'm going to share something. It's really more of a headcanon than anything. It's not necessarily anything that I have a whole lot of evidence for. But if you remember, some of you do, back in season 5, there was a social media post that was posted and then taken down, and a lot of us still have it. People took screenshots of it that showed Beth going down the elevator shaft. And it was a shot that we didn't actually see in the episode, where she's like looking through the open doors of an elevator as she's being lowered down. And it says first escape attempt. And everybody really, really pounced on that, especially after Coda happened, because first escape attempt suggests there will be a second. And we didn't actually see a second, right? After that, she got shot, and that was the end of Coda. So it just very much suggests that she was going to try and escape again. And now we have Rick being paralleled here, and he's tried to escape many times. So I guess I've always had this kind of headcanon that maybe, even though they talk about how nobody escapes from the CRM ever, maybe somebody once did, and maybe that was Beth. And so she's somewhere out there on the outside. And I could, like I said, it's a headcanon. I could be totally wrong about that. She could still be within the organization somewhere. But we've seen symbolism for both things, both that she will be with the CRM and that she'll be like a rebel fighting against them. And that makes me think that she is going to be with them for a while, like Rick was. But eventually she's going to get away and fight, be somebody who is a rebel who fights them. Anyway, so this just made me think of that all the more, and that, that might actually be a thing, but who knows? So we have this Okafor guy who helps Rick. We learn that pretty quickly after he got to the CRM, they recognized that he was not a B, he was an A. So let's talk about the A's and the B's. They finally gave us a definition for what they are, and it's pretty much what people had thought, or at least most people had some variation on this. A's are people who are really strong, who will die for what they believe in, and can get other people to follow them. And so because of that, the CRM generally kills those kinds of people, because they're the kind of people who can start revolutions and insurrections, and the CRM does not want that. So these kinds of people are always killed. Bs are more like everyday people just trying to survive, who will go with the flow, who will not put up a fight, who will not, cause the problems that the CRM doesn't want. So they are the people who are allowed to live. And I was just actually talking to my fellow theorists the other day and saying that I felt like an A was synonymous with death or the dead or even walkers. And that's not really true, but it's true in the sense that the CRM always kills them. So a lot of the A's out there end up as walkers. They end up dead. And as Okafor said, they are people who will die for what they believe in, and a lot of times they do. Okay, so if you think back to 905, when everything that happened with Rick, Jadis originally took him hostage for a while and kept him in a container and had written an A on the outside. And that's because Jadis isn't an idiot. Clearly, Rick is a leader and someone people will follow. But then when she had the CRM come extract her, she changed it and said he's a B. Now, why would she do that? It was probably to save his life. I mean, Jadis has always been sweet on Rick in originally kind of a creepy way. But, as time went on, she actually spent a lot of time at Alexandria. And I think she genuinely respected him as a person and as a leader. And she knew if he was an A, then they wouldn't take him or they would just kill him. So she said he was a B, probably in the hopes that he would be able to live inside the CRM. But again, the CRM, they're not idiots either. You don't keep this kind of organization going and keep it from falling apart, with so much strength and so much secrecy by being an idiot. Like, they would have known really quickly that he was not someone who was just going to fall into line. But Okafor, I keep trying to put an N in his name, stepped in and basically protected Rick and wanted him to survive, along with this other woman named Pearl Thorne, which I think that name is very on purpose, right? And it's because Okafor really wants good people to step up and change the CRM. And this is actually something that I've thought for a long time. There is going to be a war, I believe, between Team Family and the CRM, but it's not going to be so much a matter of them winning the war and breaking apart the organization. Not like it was as much with the Saviors and All Out War. I think it's going to be more a matter of Rick taking control of the CRM, and he will lead it, and it will become a good organization, where right now, not so much, right? So that does sound like that's where they're going with it. Rick does join the army after a while, and this actually struck me as a parallel, to Daryl, who joined the Commonwealth Army. So both of them did that, and everyone was way shocked when Daryl joined that army, but I think we're just seeing the same thing here. They're leaders who are doing what they feel they have to do in order to achieve what they want to achieve. it really kind of blew my mind that Rick is actually flying the helicopters. Like, that is something I would not have thought of. And that's actually super cool. So I really like it. But I was surprised to see that. At one point, Rick meets with Major General Beale. I love Terry O'Quinn, and I'm so excited that he's in the show. But it's hard to get a read on his character yet. We kind of have to assume that he's mostly a villain, especially given what happened with his son in The World Beyond. He does seem like he kind of knows that Rick is lying and he's not doing anything about it. So that makes you wonder exactly what his agenda is. But I'm going to kind of go ahead and assume that he's mostly a villain for now. But it'll be interesting to see where they go with that. So after Rick does join the army, he does plan one more escape and attempts it. But it gets foiled, basically because this little girl walks up and that stops him. He goes to try and help her, and then Thorne shows up and says she saw the whole thing. She also says that Okafor knows about him, and that even if he were to get away, Okafor would just go find him. He wouldn't really get away, and that Okafor knows things about him. Before we get into him talking to Okafor, we see him sketching out routes under the city, and he asks his friend to help him, which he does. But there was a poker scene that was really interesting that I wanted to point out. W.D. Way asked if I had been able to get a look at Rick's cards, because it's really dark, the shot where he looks at his cards. And I was able to lighten it enough to see what it is. And it's actually the King of Hearts. Now, obviously, the King works very well for Rick. But the thing about it is, I'm pretty sure he's bluffing here. I'm not an expert on poker, but the King of Hearts, and then you look at what's laid out on the table, but there's not really a winning hand there. But if you watch the whole sequence, he looks at his cards and then he pushes all of his chips, which he has a lot of chips, into the middle. And what that tells his fellow players is that he is very confident that the hand he has is going to win. And so Thorne immediately folds and throws her cards into the center. But the point is, he's bluffing, right? So I think what they're trying to say here is not only is he winning by lying, but he's learned from Thorne how to bluff, how to have a poker face. And she talks about earlier in the episode how she was really, really good at poker, so much so that she went to Vegas to try her luck there. And if he's fooling her, then he's become very, very good at this. So I think what they're trying to say is that he's going to pretend to be part of the CRM, and he's going to be very, very good at it, but it's what's going to ultimately help him to win and to reach his goals. So that was really interesting. And of course, the King card is Rick. Okay, what else do we have? He talks to Okafor, and basically what Okafor tells him is just that he went back and found that message in a bottle that Rick left for Michonne and read it, and he found the phones that Rick threw up onto the boat that have her image on them. And so Okafor kind of would know where to look for Rick. He knows Michonne's name and that is the woman that Rick is looking for, but he also would probably start there and pan out to search for Rick. And basically what he said is that if Rick got away, Okafor would be able to find him and track him, and then he would have to kill not only Rick, but Michonne and Rick's family and anyone else he ran into. So while I don't think that would necessarily happen if Okafor did trace Rick all the way back to Alexandria, I kind of think the Alexandrians would just kill him. But that would, in Rick's mind, that's bringing his people into danger too, because at that point, the CRM would be focused on Alexandria, and he doesn't want that. And that may be as much of a reason for why he finally kind of gives up and decides not to try and escape anymore as anything else, because he doesn't want to put them in danger, for sure. But of course, by the end of the episode, things really turn. But I'll get to that in a minute. What Okafor tells Rick is that he's going to be helping convert an old college campus into a base. And we're not actually told if that's in Omaha or if that's the place, the college that was wiped out in The World Beyond, but there's definitely kind of a tie there. But the thing that's interesting is that Okafor says they're converting this into a, functioning, highly protected base, and in 1 year's time, all the high-level CRM leaders are going to have a summit there and meet there. Okay, I want you to think about that. Rick now knows when the entire leadership is going to be there and when. And I'm thinking we're probably moving toward that, maybe not even in this first season, but eventually that's probably how they're going to take out the CRM, is all of the leadership will be there. And if they can take them all out, then there goes the leadership, right? So that was kind of a strategically placed hint to where they're sort of heading, I think. I also noticed that in this scene when Rick confronts Okafor and they fight, he's in a room full of plants, and it looks exactly like the room that Beth and Noah meet in at Grady. It's like a horticulture kind of room where they're growing all kinds of medicinal things. And yeah, anyway, that was just like another parallel to Grady. But they do get news of Omaha's downfall, which is interesting because it tells us where Rick is in conjunction with the world beyond, which is interesting. So they are starting to connect timelines over shows for us just a little bit, even if it's not super, super specific. So then about the time that they get the information about Omaha, Thorne comes in to talk to Rick about the little girl that he saw that kept him from going through with his escape plan. And everything she says there is really interesting. And I don't know exactly what it means. I think it could be a hint at Beth, but it could also be a hint at other things. But it reminded me so much of the conversation he had with Clara in 401. Clara, if you remember, she was the woman that he found and wanted to take him to her husband, but then she kind of betrayed him and tried to feed him to her husband and then ended up stabbing herself, right? Well, in that conversation with her, she was telling him that they were trying to get out of the port of Vallarta, which is in Mexico, and that there were these statues of kids playing leapfrog. And people have really, TDers have zeroed in on that, especially because of the frog symbol. And Clara was just interesting, really, really interesting. And it was hard to know exactly what she symbolized. I mean, very disturbing, right? It was a really, really sad, very small arc that just happened in the first episode of the first season, where number one, Gimple had taken over as showrunner, and number two, Beth was front and center with Daryl. So it just seemed really important. Well, Thorne tells Rick in this episode that this little girl, she was with a community, including her parents, and they all, the dead got in, basically they all died. But the little girl hid in this big sculpture, and the sculpture was of a grasshopper with sharp spines. And it's just really oddly specific, right? But we're back to sculptures, which is what Rick and Clara talked about. Grasshopper, not exactly the same thing as a frog, but it kind of feels like it's in the same vein. And this little girl survived. And then she talks about how she came out, but she was covered in basically walker gore, and then the walkers didn't attack her. So we have kind of a reference to the Whisperers and how they moved around, right? And the little girl survived that way. She was moving around with her parents, but her parents were walkers. But because she was covered in walker gore, the walkers couldn't see her, as we know, and didn't attack her. And then Rick found her. And so this just feels like the little girl looked like she had light hair. It was hard to tell because she was very dirty. But if she is blonde, I think that's important. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not even saying 100% that is a foreshadow of Beth, although it might be. But again, we saw it in 401 with Clara, and that was when Gimple took over, and that was when we got the Beth and Daryl hug. And I just feel like whatever it's pointing to was something that was planned, at least somewhat, back then. And now the fact that we're doing this again, it's about to kind of come front and center as an important arc, and kind of that symbolism is about to be fulfilled. So I think we'll know it when we see it, and if it is more of a Rick thing, then okay. But there's not a lot here to suggest that little girl is Michonne necessarily, or, maybe at some point Rick and Michonne will have to become part of a walker horde in order to get away. I don't know. Like I said, I think we'll know it when we see it, but it was just really interesting to me how much that paralleled his conversation with Clara in 401. And Clara's always been a little bit of a question mark. We've theorized about it, but we're still not, I don't feel like we've hit the fulfillment of what she was meant to foreshadow. But now with this little girl kind of having a very similar story in a way, I think it's more of the same thing, and whatever that foreshadows, it's coming now. We're going to see it very, very soon. So that was just super, super interesting. So then, of course, as I said, he burned everything, and then he dreams of Michonne again, and this time she's wearing white, which I thought was interesting. And she tells him, "You're not stuck anywhere," as though to give him hope that he can still get away. And this is one other thing that jumped out at me, one other line that I just have to question. He says, in the dream, it's almost like they're meeting for the first time and they're flirting with each other. And at one point he says, "What if I come back sometime with 5 pizzas and a wedding ring?" Why 5 pizzas? I got to ask, why 5? 5 isn't really a Rick number. I mean, yeah, he was in season 5. He was a big part of season 5, but why 5? why pick that number? It's kind of an odd thing to say. He's already there with the pizza. So why 5 pizzas and a wedding ring? 5 is always something that we've associated with Beth just because that was her last season. And maybe that's not what they're going for. I don't know. But I just felt like that was obviously a really intentional line. Why 5 pizzas and a wedding ring? And it's being associated with romance, So I'm not sure what that means, but I like it, and I feel like it's very, very intentional, and I can't help but think of Beth when they say things like that. So then we kind of get the final scene, and Rick once again tells a story about his past. And again, this is tying us back to 510, not because necessarily of what the story is about. I mean, it is about his past and about his father this time rather than his grandfather, but I remember when 510 aired, and then they did the Talking Dead afterward, they talked about how this was so significant, the speech Rick gives in 510, because he's talking about his past. He's talking about his grandfather. And Rick never does this. He doesn't talk about his past. He doesn't talk about his family. It's very, very rare. And so because of that, it's a really fun and interesting insight into him that we very rarely get. Well, he's doing it again. So just the fact that he's doing this is another way to tie us back to 510 and see the parallels there. In this case, he talks about being 7 years old, and he came downstairs, and he was clearly raised on a farm, and the crops were burning, and his father came in and had burns all over him from, what seemed to Rick at the time that he was trying to fight the fire. But his father just stayed really calm and said everything was going to be okay. And it wasn't the end of the farm. It was just the beginning. And, then Rick remembers too that the next year the crops was the best that they'd ever had. So his father was right. And not until after his father died did he understand that his father actually lit the fire because the crops were going to fail and the farm was going to fail, and it was the only way he could think of to save his family and his farm. And Rick talks about how that really shook him because he had always seen his father as someone who was really, really honest. And so it freaked him out that his dad did that, basically. But now as a man, as a grown-up, and everything he's been through and a family of his own, he understands that his father was just doing what he had to do to save his family, and that sometimes you have to light a fire, right? So he's seeing that in his mind as the best way to save his family is to stay with the CRM for the time being. I do, though, have to point out that the official or original firelighters were Beth and Daryl. So I feel like that's a tie as well. Fires are about to be lit, and, both literally and symbolically. But when Beth and Daryl lit that fire in season 4, obviously that was a foreshadow of something. And now Rick is actually talking about lighting fires to start the war, to find his family, to try and save the world, basically. So it's super interesting stuff. And this is why I'm so lit up about this episode. It's fantastic from a symbolism point of view, and I'm loving it. But of course, after that, they get shot down. Now, Rick says something really interesting. Okafor gets some sort of pipe that goes through him when they first get hit. So he was dying anyway. And Rick calls out KIA. This is just interesting because that was something that was written on Morgan's wall back in Clear. And it's something that's been discussed a lot. And, KIA means killed in action. It is a military term. And a lot of people have said that for a long time, but we didn't know exactly what it meant being written on Morgan's wall. And his said no KIAs on, I want to say it was BEF. And so no KIAs suggests no killed in action. And people wondered if BEF, just because of the B, it sounds like Beth's name. And of course, we don't know exactly what they were going for with that. But now we're actually hearing someone use the term KIA, which is interesting. I mean, once again, guys, you got to understand, everything written on the wall in Clear was written by Gimple. Okay, that was one of those minor arcs that he took charge of, and he wrote everything on those walls. And that's why we have always really heavily analyzed it, especially in the wake of Coda, because we feel like there are hints there. And some of the things have actually come true. There was something that said, I want to say it was Zach. Zach turned, and Zach ended up being the name of Beth's boyfriend in season 4, and he was bitten, right? So I'm not saying that Gimple knew that's how he would fulfill it. He just wrote that on the wall, and then later he could go back to that and say, okay, this character is going to be named Zach, And so just Gimple always fulfills his symbolism, so that's why it's important. So he did that in clear. And we know that Beth's arc, especially in season 2, her suicide arc, was 100% him. He 100% was in charge of that, created the arc, kept her around as best he could. And then when he took over as showrunner, which he was full showrunner starting in season 4, 401, that's when she was front and center, and we got the Beth and Daryl hug, and the romance between them, really became very, very apparent. And now we are watching The Ones Who Live, and he is not just the executive producer, he is the showrunner, because the CRM does not exist in the comics any more than Beth or Daryl did, right? So this is Gimple's story beyond the comics. And that is why now that we're done with all the comic book material, we went through the Commonwealth and everything from here on out is 100% Gimple's original storytelling. And that's really, really exciting. And that's why we will probably finally get Beth and Daryl now, where we didn't before. They had to go through the comic book material. And this is something that I think Gimple has been planning for since he took over in season 4, if not earlier. So that's super excited. Of course, the helicopter crashes, which kind of brings things full circle in an interesting way, since season 1, Rick saw a helicopter flying around Atlanta, and then in season 3, there actually was a helicopter crash that had to do with the governor storyline, so I thought it was interesting that he was in a helicopter crash. And I was wondering at this point, I wonder who is attacking them, because whoever is attacking them is doing a pretty good job of bringing down the CRM helicopter. I mean, these are not just guerrilla rebels in the woods, that they have artillery, like they're being pretty effective here. And then, of course, the person who almost killed him ended up being Michonne, and we get them coming from face to face. So I'm assuming that next episode will be mostly about Michonne. So this episode was mostly about Rick, and he just came face to face with her at the end. I'm kind of thinking they'll do the same thing next week with Michonne. We'll see her whole struggle from the last time we saw her up until now, until she comes face to face with Rick, which means they're not going to get a whole lot of screen time until at least episode 3, but even so, it was a really great episode, and I'm loving the symbolism, and I'm sure I missed things. I need to go back and watch it again, but they're definitely hinting at things, and I'm really, really excited to see where it goes. So let me know what you guys thought about this episode and what you're excited to see most in The Ones Who Live. And yeah, like I said, I will try to get more of your asks answered throughout the week as best I can. So feel free to keep putting them in. I'll try to answer the most relevant ones to this episode first, and then I'll work backward from there. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. I really did. And that's what I have. And I'll see you soon.